welcome to this session in our Hope Against Hope series of vodcasts for COP26. My name is Heather Walton, and today I will be talking to Catherine Keller. Catherine is Professor of Constructive Theology at the Theological School of Drew University and well known as a leading advocate of an environmentally committed and relevant social theology. So, Catherine, I'd like to begin by talking about theology and the work of a theologian. I remember when my daughter was little, she asked me what I did, and I tried to explain to her, and I thought I'd done a pretty good job. She thought about it carefully and said to me, "Mummy, when you were my age, didn't you want to do something more interesting with your life?" I wonder how you became involved in this theological enterprise. What brought you to it?
Well, it was probably not seeking anything more interesting, because my upbringing was a little too much of that. I mean, it was an upbringing with a lot of adventure, moves between 3 continents. By the time I was 10, I lived in Africa for a while, in Athens, Greece. But there was trauma behind the mobility. So we were really quite a migrant family. There was brain damage, therefore the inability to keep jobs for long. And there was tremendous, well, I'll just say it, alcoholic dysfunction and rage. So it was quite difficult childhood, even though there was also a great breadth of experience. So I think what theology offered was not escape and peace. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't have had access to something so calm and staid. But I think that it offered something that went deeper than any of my personal sorrows and traumas. And it went broader than the world that my family had to bounce around in such challenging, unstable ways. So there was something that encompassed everything and did hold me in it. And I didn't mind calling it love. And I think that I actually just had some good luck. I had the good luck that my family was not at all involved in traditional forms of Christianity, just occasionally, and with some significance for me in a mainline Protestantism. But my mother, who was the thinker and talker, really loved Nietzsche, and was more of an artist. I'm frustrated, thwarted because of being a woman, et cetera, in her period. But I wasn't ever subjected to fundamentalist forms of Christianity, so I could experiment freely, and at 18, a particular professor of Old Testament in college just opened my brain to not just First Testament kinds of social justice inspiration, but he played Jesus Christ Superstar for us. That was just on Broadway. This is the very early, the 70s, probably 1970. And so I was lucky to become aware of this rather hip edge of Christianity that was developing some feminist voice too. So between that prophetic depth and that cutting edge feminism, I found a pathway, and was just very graced with some meaningful encounters that led me forward in the academic study of theology.
Well, that's such a lovely image of theology literally leading you into a broader space and into a space of more profound space, and a space of beauty and holding. I wish I'd had some of those words to talk to my daughter all those years ago about that.
I want to know what she thinks now.
I think think she'd probably think it was more exciting now than she did then, but
Excellent.
maybe. But you also talk about in one of your books about encountering the war-torn work of Tillich, a theologian who had experienced the deep suffering of the trenches and was trying to make theology out of ruins and out of chaos. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that sort of formative encounter with that kind of theology.
Yes, right. I think I was about 20 at that point, and it was one of these characters. This was early in seminary. The professor, one of these professors who saw through my chaos and recognized there's something there to work with, and he introduced me to Tillich. And what I loved in Tillich was of course, that depth, but that depth that is the ground of being, that is called God. It's also called the abyss. That really resonated with me, given the abysmal depths that I had experienced all too young. So that there's a divinity to the abyss was really mystically moving to me. And I think the other important two pieces with Tillich were that he would insist that God does not exist in the sense of being a being, which usually existence means, but is the ground of being. That helped me because I just couldn't really get in touch with Sunday school anthropomorphic images of him up there, the being. So this being itself, this oceanic sense, that really has forever stayed with me. And the third really important point is that he insisted that doubt has a crucial place in faith, because if faith doesn't sometimes experience doubt, then it's really just a form of certainty. Then it's knowledge, not faith. So that there's this uncertainty that, with both its sense of anxiety and adventure, that it admits the importance of doubt. And that's been crucial to me in the different phases of doubting this and that aspect of traditional religion, and of helping my students to bring their doubts out as well.
Creatively, yes, yeah. But I think it was very much a life-changing experience when you encountered the process thought of Alfred North Whitehead and the theology of John Cobb. When I read your work, and I love to read your work, it's beautifully written, I sense a homecoming in your encounter with process thought and process theology. I wonder if you can describe how it came to mean so much to you, and what it illuminated and resolved.
Yes, right. No, it was surprising that a theology that was born in the brain of this actually British mathematician, Alfred North Whitehead, then could create a very dynamic movement and could attract me. But it is the notion that everything that exists is in process, and that everything that exists in its process is a process of relationships. So that what you are and what I am at this moment is, to some significant extent, a relationship between us. That's already becoming part of who we will always be. That who I will always be and who you will always be is a series of events. And so we are, in that sense, processes, not substances, not fixed identities, not self-identical subjects in a world of self-identical objects. So it's not a vision that's all about stability. So you can see how that appealed to one of the most destabilized persons I know from early childhood myself. So it gave a cosmological framework to just continual becoming, continual process, and a process that's a constant interactivity with the world around us, particularly, but also with the whole world of our past that we carry within us, mostly unconsciously, but also just with the whole world, period. Because you can't draw a dividing line between what has some influence on you and what has absolutely none, because what has very little influence will have then its own very little influence on something even further. So there's a way that everything gets implicated in everything else. And I found that gorgeous, and I found that persuasive, because I'd been around in the world enough, and I always found a way of being connected wherever I was, and making connections consciously pretty quickly. So maybe I was more alert to the connectivity of a restless, dynamic universe. And I loved that this was a form of theology that stayed in good contact with the natural sciences, was particularly inspired by Whitehead's working really early, in the 30s already, in and through the mathematics of relativity, and especially of quantum uncertainty and indeterminacy. So that dialogue with physics and with every other science has gone on and been very meaningful. It's a deeply transdisciplinary vision, and it takes one's understanding of God into a very different vocabulary, a very different sensibility than what most of us have had access to or have been taught. I'm not. Okay, now I hear you. Sorry.
That was my fault. And process thought in this, explored relational ontologies before they became fashionable. These days, everybody's relational, but process thinking was way ahead and provided the resources to really grapple with interrelationship and entanglement many years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And it has additionally the sense of of God entangled in the world and the world entangled in God. Whitehead and process thought doesn't directly use that language of entanglement, but I've been enjoying bringing it in for the past several years because of the physics of entanglement. But it's a view of God as enriched by and and provocative of the relationships within the universe. A God who is luring those creatures all entangled in one way or another within each other to greater creativity, greater complexity in their interrelationships, and greater harmony at the same time. So the sense of vast togetherness in becoming seems to be at the heart of the sense of the divine. Excuse me. Sorry about that. It's not COVID, it's chronic.
It's too many years of lecturing.
Might have done it.
Yeah. So, Catherine, I've been inspired by your work for many years, and not least because of its political urgency. And you've written about how the anti-nuclear movement sort of awoke in you a sense of the entanglement between human beings and the natural environment that was crucial to our future and our existence. So again, when many people weren't really thinking so much about the environment, you were already trying to grapple with that from a theological perspective.
Yes. The nuclear menace was vivid for me for a time in the 80s. Um, and I think that helped me at the same time to think in terms of global force fields of political entanglement and of the importance of retaining a sense of globality, the kind of harm that can happen globally and all at once if it were nuclear disaster. But that also then, as I was learning, moves about the planet economically through a form of neoliberal global capitalism that we're all too familiar with, that is more than anything responsible for the degradation of the planet's ecology. So I suppose that thinking about the planetarity of the nuclear issue did tune me in a different way to then the planetarity of climate change. Of course, John Cobb, who was the process theologian I went to study with, had written in a book that was published in 1970 called Is It Too Late?, which was about environmental destruction. So I was studying with one of the prophets of our ecological crisis. I was thinking about the connection to nuclear bombs and the environmental crisis. I just read a few days ago that the ocean is absorbing such heat through climate change, which is of course very destructive for the life of the sea, et cetera, and therefore the life of us all. Production of oxygen from the sea, it's 50 to 80%. It's coming up from the bottom of the chain of the life of the sea to us, little known. But the point is, it's warming at an alarming rate. And the way this is getting described right now is that it is every second, the ocean is warmed to the amount of 5 nuclear bombs going off. So the amount of warming that 5 nuclear explosions would make is happening every second to the planet's oceans. It's unthinkable, isn't it? But I've now come across that metaphor a couple of times, so I think it's for real. So that's just an image that connects those two very different concerns about nuclear weaponry and now this actually much more serious problem of climate change.
If somebody were to ask me to describe you, I think I would say you are a theologian of the unthinkable in many ways, which we'll talk more about. But I think the first book of yours that I really found very, very challenging and wonderful to read was Face of the Deep. And I liked it because of its embrace of poetic, scriptural, but also political and liberative issues in one space and in one place. But it took me a while to understand it, I have to admit. Because it was encouraging me to think in ways that I wasn't used to. And in particular, in that book, you explore creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, and you contrast it with creation ex profundis, from out of the deep. And it took me a long time to understand the differences between those and why they mattered. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, because there may be people listening who haven't encountered that way of thinking before.
Yes, thank you. That meditation on the deep was in some ways a meditation on the second verse of the Bible, where we hear about the earth, tohu vabohu, and darkness over the face of the deep, and the spirit vibrating over the mayim, the waters. And so that that darkness over the face of the deep did preoccupy me during the period of writing that book, and probably ever since as well. Of course, there's a strong biblical argument, which I try to develop in the book, drawing on biblical scholarship, because biblical scholars for a long time have admitted, sometimes quite unhappily, as for instance with Klaus Westermann, I studied with a bit at Heidelberg, that though he as a Christian believes, of course, that God created everything ex nihilo from nothing, that's not what the Bible says. There is this deep already always there, over which this darkness is envisioned, and the spirit then vibrating there, and somehow out of that deep, like an infinite womb, the universe emerges. So I found that just inherently beautiful and interesting in itself, as opposed to a one-shot creation. And fundamentalists in my country, of course, love that, out of nothing, because it really demonstrates God's absolute omnipotence. And there's still a lot of them trying to go with the 7 days, make it really fast. But for me, what was really at stake there was, on the theological level, the question of what kind of power God works with. Because the argument for the ex nihilo doctrine was, from the beginning with Irenaeus, an argument from and for divine omnipotence in the sense of an all control, because God is all controlling. God creates all that there is from absolute nothing. So it's a very unilateral creative power, and it doesn't really jive with the text of Genesis, which is much more invitational. It's a let it be kind of power. Let there be light, let there be all these marvelous creatures who seem really good, at least at that stage. And that letting be is a very different kind of power than what the standard cliches of Christianity have developed. And because the Genesis 1 story is really the story of origin, it seemed important to struggle for an alternative right there in the depths of that beginning. So I suggested the metaphor of the creatio ex profundis, creation from the depths, as an alternative to the ex nihilo, partly as a way of honoring the utter bottomless depth of that creative source, but also to then open up into the relationality, whereby it's inviting a kind of co-creativity. Let the waters bring forth, let the earth bring forth, and then human beings, as these ones in God's image, able to bring forth all kinds of sometimes good things and all kinds of destruction as well, because there's so much freedom. And there's freedom down at the quantum level, it's called indeterminacy down there. And the freedom mounts and mounts with more complex creatures. And if we don't take into full account how much responsibility we have for the co-creative life of the universe, well, we don't take responsibility for it. We become irresponsible as a civilization, as we have become, so very dangerously now. So it seemed to me that a whole understanding of power and what kind of power is at play in the creation becomes crucial, because if we are in the image of that God, then our power will in some ways reflect that power. And it has in the Christian West, the West in general. I think at this point that it would mean just, again, top-down power given a kind of divine sanction. So it's felt very important to me to stay with that meditation on an alternative power that creates in and with the chaos, the unformed materiality of things. The creation really from the unformed is a myth of creation from chaos, a myth, a story, a way of trying to imagine in a few words what still goes on for billions, or billions times billions of years, or beginninglessly and endlessly when we're talking about the multiverse. So I hope that image, because it's so very biblical, could help Christians, and indeed some Jews as well, to rethink what's happening with the relationship we imagine between creator and creation in this time when we creatures, we human creatures, are responsible, some of us a whole lot more than others, for a kind of work of discreation. I think it has something to do with our not honoring that depth, that abyss that is in its deepest depths, the divine abyss.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. I think that really helps to make clear why it's such an important concept in your work, and why, as you indeed say, you do return to it and meditate upon it constantly as you develop your thinking. I read a lovely conversation between you and Richard Kearney, where you argue about God's goodness. I think you were responding to some articles that Kearney wrote several years ago, where he had a very, I think, rosy vision of eschatology as a kind of new dawn. And you were asking, well, what happens to the darkness? And is not darkness part of the divine? And you speculated even further, I think, teasing Kearney a bit, about God actually must be held responsible for the darkness of creation as well. That, in a sense, the creative processes set in motion aren't innocent ones, and they have the potential for great suffering and tragedy within them, as well as for light and love. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm not remembering in great detail the conversation or the article, but I do remember enjoying, as I always do, getting into discussions and tussles with Richard Kearney and his theopoetics. So I think my point would not be that that God's partaking of that abysmal darkness of the creation and what that can mean concretely is not to say that God is responsible for the evil as well as the good in any direct sense at all. I don't. That would be a much more omnipotent God, really almost Calvinist, who is responsible for everything that happens, who in some way has foreseen and willed everything from the way of snowflake twists from all eternity. So I think nothing like that, but by that divine responsibility for the dark side of things, for what comes forth out of the deep, dark depths. What comes forth out of the deep, dark depths could be sometimes beautiful, often is, but with conscious creatures like us, with our weird, dangerous level of self-conscious knowledge, it seems, as the Garden of Eden suggests, so metaphorically, to have also led to great evil. And so what I want to say is not that God is causing that evil. He's not causing our good choices either. He's calling forth possibilities that we choose for or against. He in the biblical sense, sorry, but yeah, this this divine source is not causing the evil in the world and not directly causing the good, but calling forth the creative process in its complexification. But I think, just simply put, the point would be that because God understood this way, is calling forth, is responsible for increasing evolutionary complexity in the universe, and therefore choices that can be very destructive come out of it. That God is responsible for the possibility of the evil that free choices make, that free choices entail. That if the freedom is being encouraged, sustained, called forth, it's also a freedom from God and a freedom from the good that is always very possible. That's why our species seems to be so involved in a kind of reckless freedom from any sense of ultimate good. So my point isn't that God is responsible for the evil in the universe in any direct sense at all, but responsible for the indeterminacy and freedom as the very terms of the creation, in which unpredictable directions obtain and develop. But that makes it all the more important for us as a species to try to tune better to what some of us will call God, what others will call wisdom, what others might just call sanity, or ecological survival, social justice. We have a lot of different names for the ultimate source of our ethics, but for some of us that might be God, and the possibility is always available in that relationship for better choices, and better if there's a ripple effect, if we're able to work communally and collectively. And part of that collective work would be theological work. It keeps us motivated.
Absolutely. It's a very important message, I think, at this particular time in the middle of COP to make, actually, that choice, those moments of decision, and the ways that things can go through our choices. The way you describe the entangled creative possibilities that we have, our relationships together, and the way that you view these as having the potential to tend towards justice and the good, etc., brings you into sympathy with the concerns of feminists and liberation theologians. And I know that you've worked closely with many people who would call themselves feminist liberation theologians. But your vision of the divine is slightly different in that it doesn't really allow you to say, in one sense, I know who God is and I know what God wants. You take a rather different path. So you're not saying, well, God told us through the prophets, this is how we must live, so go and live like that. You turn instead to traditions in which God is unknowable, hidden, encountered in cloud and darkness. Some people would think that this hinders you in making a strong ethical stance on issues like climate injustice. I wonder how you'd respond to that, Catherine. Does it trouble you? Or is it for you the sine qua non of making a political response in our current context?
Well, I'd love to just take the question mark off of your question, and there would be a statement that I could just say yes, amen to, because this is your own thinking getting in there in a beautiful way. That's helpful. Yeah. So this theology that I've found very meaningful, especially in the last couple of decades, increasingly so-called negative theology, ancient name for it, or apophatic theology, this theology that is aware that ultimately finite creatures can't know the infinite. I mean, that's usually how the argument goes, that that whatever insights, reasoning processes, and indeed revelations we are privy to, we remain finite in our capacity to do anything, and certainly to know anything. And so we do not know the infinite. And whatever we do know, we know from a perspective. Every theological proposition is from a perspective. And you and I are operating on one little screen right now, but from profoundly different life contexts, national contexts, theological contexts, perspectives, not to mention the family context. So everything is perspectival. That doesn't mean one doesn't know anything, but it does invite one to be very conscious of the limits of what we know, especially when we're talking about that which is illimitable. this divine depth of reality, and so I've been very persuaded by that, because I know that I don't know God. And I know almost as certainly that anyone who tells me that they do is wrong. I just haven't ever been persuaded by anyone speaking with that kind of doctrinaire certainty. I've been persuaded by endless insights of so many people, theologians, pastors, and folk on the street, poets. But I've been persuaded by the truth of something about what they're saying about God. But that truth is also not about an objective mirror on the thing. Truth is a relationship. It's a relationship of mindful engagement with the other, that one is in some way perceiving, knowing. And knowing for me has that biblical edge of relationality, of erotic knowing, of taking part in that which one knows. So it's always always perspectival. So yeah, often when theology is doing direct ethical social work, as much liberation theology has done and feminist theology has done, it has to speak more directly, and with more certitude. And that depends on context, of course. And so then from that point of view, where you're needing to emphasize the clarity and the strength of your critique of an oppressive status quo, of its racism, of its economic destructiveness and classism, of its sexism, when you're having to work to just disarm a presupposition or systemic evil, often the language is going to get more direct. But it seems to me that it's crucial, even for folk who are doing directly liberation work, if they're going to stay honest, to have also contemplative time. And so many of them do, with the great examples of Gandhi meditating hours a day, and Martin Luther King absorbing much of that meditative practice into his prayer life. I mean, these great activist leaders are often great meditators or prayers, who I believe are tuning in to that mystery. It's not that they're just going into their into their quiet space to get an order from God about just what to do. I'm sure they, like we all, welcome anything explicit that might come up. But they need, leaders in social activism also need regular meditative pause, solitary and communal. And I think that allows them to get in touch. It allows us to get in touch with the mystery of things. And for apophatic theology, it wasn't just the mystery of God, but in some sense, therefore, the mystery of the creation and of everything within it. So Heather, I'm hopeful that in fact, knowing our unknowing allows us to be more selective and wise about where to act, how to commit our energies, how not to trick ourselves into some sense of omniscience and false certainty, but rather, how to work with the uncertainties, the probabilities, and therefore the real possibilities of our existence. But it's a different way of knowing God, where we're not knowing God as a thing that we can know, an entity. But again, the knowing is a kind of loving, which reminds me of this line from the poet Rilke, that knowledge will come to an end, but love never ends. And that's theological.
Absolutely. I love the way that you say that many theologians just don't understand the apophatic tradition. They think it's, and you quote sort of Monty Python, oh, just shut up. It's about whereas you talk about the apophatic tradition, because it doesn't know, it has to invest deeply in symbols and imagery, in a dazzling array of dark representations or shadows
Mhm.
or traces or whatever that allow different sorts of creation to take place theologically. And you just think, oh, if only people would, in a sense, let themselves explore that as a different theological way. Um,
Yes.
um, so much creativity might be engendered.
And humility in the creativity as well. And if we lose our humility, of course, our creativity begins to blanch and to fade as well. I wanted just to mention a theologian. I've been very moved by getting to know the work of the 15th century theologian Nicholas of Cusa, and the Roman Catholic cardinal of all things. But he's in that great tradition of apophatic mysticism and negative theology, knowing that we don't know. So De Docta Ignorantia is perhaps his most known text, of knowing ignorance, that is, of knowing of our ignorance. And only in knowing our ignorance can our conjectures, as he calls them, about the universe and about God carry some truth. But I'm thinking of him because it's in his understanding of the universe as immediately created by coming forth from this divine infinity that's ultimately unknowable, but that gives us insights into it all nonetheless. So it's from his cosmology that it seems that Copernicus got his clue that the Earth is not the center of the universe. So if you go to De Docta Ignorantia, its second book, you will read him speculating out of his apophatic theology about the world, and reflecting on an earlier medieval conundrum about God as the sphere whose circumference is nowhere, and whose center is everywhere. So he meditates on that, again, thinking now, well, then the universe is something like that because it comes directly from God. And he says, if the universe has no circumference, that means the universe is also a certain kind of infinite, not the negative infinity of the divine, but a certain kind of infinite, of worlds within worlds. And he says, and if that's true, and its center is therefore everywhere, it means the Earth is not the center of the universe, and that no celestial body is the center of the universe. So I just thought, isn't that crazy? I mean, there that comes, 1425, right? And yeah, that enormous thought. Now, he didn't get persecuted. He was friend for it. Like at first, his friend was the Pope. They'd gone to college together in Heidelberg. But I'm just pointing out that this is a great theologian of the apophatic tradition, the tradition of knowing that we don't know, of this deeply humble unknowing. But look at what kind of knowledge, what kind of scientific knowledge is breaking through there at the pitch of genius, cosmological genius, crucial then, apparently, to Copernicus. So, yeah, this kind of apophatic unknowing can only be equated with ignorance by people who are just ignorant of what the apophatic tradition is about.
I love the way that in your major work, Cloud of the Impossible, you focus upon Cusa, whom you clearly love. It's a very intense passion that you have for his work that is very, very, communicates very deeply. But you also use the work of thinkers like Karen Barad, you refer to Deleuze. So you bring Nicholas of Cusa into dialogue with all these contemporary ideas of entanglement and relationality. It's a very exciting, heady theological mix.
Well, good. I'm glad it sustains some energy and your interest. But I love bringing these different thinkers of entanglement into a strange entanglement from a theological angle. You know, from Cusa, we get this formulation. I'll just quote this again this is from the 1429 text, and that's that because everything is in everything and all is in all, therefore God is in everything and everything is in God. Period. So, as far as I know, he's the first thinker of the radical interconnectedness of everything in the universe, or the first Western thinker who really formulates that so specifically and indeed cosmologically. So it seems fair to draw him into conversation of an indirect sort with a thinker like Barad, and I'm interpreting Barad and her philosophy of science or science theory, always also in Whiteheadian terms, because Whitehead really perhaps first articulates the full philosophical cosmology of dynamic interrelatedness. But then Karen Barad, from her marvelously feminist queer science studies point of view, deep immersion in the physics, is able to really work with the entanglement theory of physics itself to look at the way that if we meet the universe halfway, we discover that we are endlessly enmeshed in each other, in the creatures around us, and therefore having to make decisions, to make cuts, which decision that Caesar means etymologically. So there's an interesting call to ethical responsibility to be aware of the kind of decisions, the kind of cuts that we make amidst the dense interrelatedness that forms us, because these cuts don't actually dissociate us from the rest of the world, but they determine our perspectives within our world and on its complexity. So the ethics with which we make our cuts, our decisions within our cosmos, really therefore gain a kind of physical basis. But I've enjoyed a lot of thinkers about the physics of entanglement. Spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it. He was hoping to get rid of it. It seemed too it seemed too mystical to him, but he tried and tried to disprove the math of it, and couldn't. Spooky action at a distance finally won, and in the 1980s completely, the math just cashed out into full empirical affirmation of this entanglement, which means that the entanglement is saying what made Einstein say that. He said, what do electrons practice telepathy? It's that if you take two electrons in a laboratory, you join them and then you disconnect them, and they'll go off in equal and opposite directions and speeds. And the spooky thing is what you do to one of them at some particular point where it is in space-time, what you do just like by measuring it, and it indeterminately responds. You will find out if you're able to measure the other one at exactly the same moment, wherever it is, a few feet away, a few miles away, thousands of miles away, or at the other side of our galaxy, presumably, is what the physicists say. When you measure it, it's going to respond in exactly the same way, the same torque. It'll respond also in a way that's unpredictable, indeterminately. These are electrons, but in exact symmetry, as though it knows exactly how its old twin is reacting. So once together, two bits of matter are always together, no matter how far separated they are. So you can see that's quite a parable for our interdependence, and how tragic it is that as a civilization, we have largely repressed and manipulated it rather than honored and loved it.
So this basic issue of our profound relationality, is our deep connectivity, is both a potential source of healing energy and change for us, but it also is we're witnessing in the cosmic destruction that we're experiencing at the moment, really, that we all are together in this destruction as well.
That's right. However innocent we are of any of the choices that are actually making the difference, that's a 1% of the population who are really responsible and rather consciously making choices to continue to poison and overheat the earth, its atmosphere, its oceans. But because we're connected to them, because we can't dissociate ourselves from them, even if we are very conscientious in our individual or communal ecological practices, we're all going to go down together eventually. But of course, in the meantime, as things just get worse, those who are doing the worst job on the planet are going to make for themselves the best retreats in nice Nordic nations. They're already buying up a lot of good spaces in the north where they and their families can go if it really starts warming up. So there's no symmetry to the human responsibility for this reckless damage of the earth, but because as a species we're inextricably interlinked with each other and with the rest of the planet. Even though some of us will go down worse and earlier than others, the damage is quite total, isn't it? That will be done because we're all webbed together. The damage is of the planetary habitability for us and a whole bunch of other species. And so we have about 10 years to make a really dramatic shift if we're going to keep under the crucial 1.5 degree centigrade. And then we have until what we're hearing 2050 to reach net zero carbon emissions. So just 10 years now, or really it's 2030. It's nice to call it 10 years. It's probably less than 10 years that we have to come up with a 45% reduction. spooky time for our interconnectedness.
We have 9 years as a species, but you and I don't have very long left to talk. We're into the end of our time. I wanted to ask you just about your latest work on apocalypse, just before we finish. It's Facing Apocalypse by Catherine Keller, a wonderful book.
Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances.
It's I wonder. I've always found your work poetic and evocative, but this book, you really are confidently speaking Keller-esque. It's ironic, it's sparky. You, in a sense, maybe freed by the language of the revelation you're reflecting upon. Really do use your own language and forethought to communicate radical ideas. I just want to give you a chance to say a little bit about why at this point you turned to Revelation, and just to entice other people to read your book, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to do that. Thank you. Because Apocalypse isn't necessarily the most enticing title. But I want to say right off the bat that I decided to write another book on the apocalypse. I had written, I believe, 96, Apocalypse Now and Then, a feminist approach to the end of the world. And you can hear the irony in that title. I was really trying to deconstruct the notion of a one-time apocalyptic ending, because I think it's very destructive to our whole historical process. But then I had to come back to this topic again, because of the way in which climate change is so much worsened and other conditions around it. For instance, the condition of democracy in the United States make one's hope a little bit fragile. That we will be able to rise to the occasion of preventing the worst damage of climate change. So I felt I had to work on the apocalypse again, partly because I was seeing it, just like newspaper headlines, like apocalyptic fires, the LA Times, a couple of years in a row in its headline. But we're hearing lots of references to just apocalypse very casually, and I don't mean fundamentalist references. I mean secular uses of the term, and often out of consternation about the direction of climate change, and sometimes quite responsible uses. People are trying to warn that this is the danger. So I thought a book needs to be out there that's accessible, and I hope this was. I hope I successfully wrote it for a wider audience. Seems
so.
I'm hoping so. I'm getting some sense that that's the case. It hasn't been out very long yet, but I think so. And I wanted it to be understood. I wanted to contribute to the realization that the very concept of apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. That the term apocalypsis, the biblical term in Greek, doesn't have anything about end in its etymology. It means unveiling. So the main uses for the term in ancient Greece were like the unveiling of the bride on her wedding night. So it's an erotic term. But the unveiling, i.e. the revealing, means disclosure, not closure. And the book of Revelation, bleak vision as it largely is, and very much not in the gospel spirit, nonetheless, is offering a certain truth, a disclosive truth. And what it's doing is disclosing the degree to which our civilization, it was couched in terms of the beast and the great whore, John of Patmos, as symbols for Roman political and economic power. So that's the Roman imperial civilization was what he was addressing. And we're heirs to that very civilization. In most ways, we're still the same civilization. So the point being that that civilization, with its power and its global economy, that's what the great whore metaphor exhibits, is profoundly destructive to the populations of the planet, human as well as non-human, as well as non-organic systems. So great destruction comes because of this unjust political and economic order. That is what's coming very clearly through the images of the book of Revelation, though that's not the way fundamentalists teach it. And it's warning about that destructive outcome. I think John had a certain determinism, sense that there would be inevitably very great damage. And there has been unfathomable horror of massacres, often perpetrated by Christians in the 2 millennia since he wrote that text, and horrible destruction at the environmental level. He talks about when the 7th seal is open, he shares that as the first vision, once the 7th seal is opened, that 7th seal from Bergman's movie, but John is then announcing that 1/3 of the life of the seas dies, and the life of the seas is poisoned, bloodied, that 1/3 of the trees of the earth die, and 1/3 of the grass of the fields. So, and one with other creatures. So, it is a prophecy that's rooted in similar older prophecies from the Hebrew prophetic tradition, but is its own work. It is a prophecy of horrific levels of damage to the planet and its peoples, based on the dominance and the acquiescence in this kind of unjust power and its greed. But so you can see there's some interesting fits there. And my point wasn't ever to say, well, he was really predicting, the events of our century. No, prophecy is not prediction. It's a kind of dream reading, I argue. It's reading deep patterns of the civilization, and it's only able to read them through symbolizations that are very graphic and vivid and contextually a little offensive, like the Great Whore. And this beast the 2 beasts actually representing them, the Roman imperial power, political oppression. So it's dream reading in very symbolic language, dreamlike language, a real power of our civilization, a pattern so powerful that we haven't outgrown it, even with the great breakthroughs that we've had ethically and spiritually all along, even with the good news of the gospel. This is still gripping us. And John recognized that the civilization would have great and destructive grip. So it helps, I think, to give that biblical glimpse of a prophetic, metaphoric sort into the dangerous pattern of our civilization, as it now seems to be coming to a head. But that's Revelation, apocalypsis. It's not about the end. There is no the end in John. The earth undergoes great turbulence and violence and destruction, and yet civilization starts afresh. Human recognizable civilization is called the New Jerusalem, and it's not just some supernatural production coming down from above. That's the symbolism. But through its gates, which are open 24/7, it's said that the kings of the earth all come in, and they're no longer under an imperial force. So they're the representatives of the nations, all coming in peacefully to this New Jerusalem with its pure, clean waters, free for everyone to drink, free water available. It was important in the Near East and the Middle East. It's going to be important to all of us soon, and it's important to a lot of us already. But these are the kings of the earth. This isn't some heaven. It's not a supernatural other place. It's a radically transformed Earth, but still with recognizably distinct nations and a political organization of a different sort. So I wanted to say that, yes, we can learn something from some meditation on this dire ancient warning about how destructive our political and economic habits are as a civilization. But we aren't going to learn anything helpful from it if we think it's about the end, and that, that God just finally is done with us, punishes it all, destroys it, but creates something supernatural and new. Well, then why bother doing anything? What's there to do except personal piety? Mm-hmm. But no, if one really lets the revelation reveal itself, like it's about recognizing the trouble that we're in, and the great danger for an end, not to the earth, not to the world, but possibly to our beautiful, livable part of of the world as our humanly habitable planet. But planet will go on, lots of species will go on, it won't be the end, and possibly humans will go on in some horribly degraded state. Or we can get the disclosure, we can open up, get untrapped from the kinds of closures that our imagination, theological, political, economic, gets trapped in. And then there's some hope for great breakthrough that's spiritual, that's transnational, that's transformative culturally and ecologically. And yeah, so I try to read that text as a kind of source of dark hope, not optimism. Karl Barth was very clear: as Christians, we are not optimists or pessimists, we are hopeful. But the hope can be pretty dire. But it's hope, and you're doing hoping against hope, which is beautiful.
Catherine, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'll be taking away a lot of what you've said and thinking about it as we go on through this series. Thank you so much.
It's wonderful as ever to communicate with you, Heather. Yes, I'm looking forward to this whole series and getting to enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.